I'm back with this beautiful mature lemon tree. Part one of this little mini series was how do we identify when a citrus tree or a lemon tree is really struggling and needs a lot of help, as well as what are those initial assessments and things you need to do to not kill it with kindness and not shock it, but gently start easing it back to its former glory. Today's video is all about what we need to do as the next step. What we need to look for to know that this tree is ready to take on the next stage of its journey to restoration, and then what we're going to look at the next phase post this, so we can ultimately give the tree what it needs to reach its former glory and an abundance of fruit. That's coming up next. So the first step in getting this tree ready was to really deep soak it, to rehydrate it and get it the moisture and water that it needed to get the strength to uncurl those leaves and start photosynthesizing and generating its own energy. How do we know that the tree is now ready to start taking on the next phase? Well, I've got both of them right here next to me, and that is, it is busy blooming everywhere. And more importantly, because your tree might not necessarily go into bloom, is that there is new growth everywhere. Tiny little pieces of new growth, and in some instances, quite a lot of new growth. It's very tender lime green growth, and that is your signal that this tree is now back to what it was in terms of energy, and now we need to get into the next steps, which are, firstly, we need to feed this tree. There is no ways this tree can keep on growing after all the hydration and now use all of its own energy that it's been struggling through to put on all this growth and fruit and flower. We need to feed it. So that's the very first thing we're going to do. So now that we know the first step is fertilizer, what do we need to actually do? Well, fertilizing is a tricky one because everybody has their own opinion on it and what they prefer to do, which is perfectly fine. You can apply what your fertilizing principles are to your own trees. But if you are not quite sure what fertilizing principles to apply, then maybe this video can help you. What I would suggest you don't do is don't go out and get a high nitrogen fertilizer. All that's going to do is put the tree into a rapid growth state. You're going to see a whole bunch of green growth, which is going to significantly increase the sugars in your plant. And as soon as you have a lot of sugars, you basically signal a food fest for pests and bugs. So what you're going to have is a lot of caterpillars and a whole bunch of things coming to eat on your tree because you've just given it all of this food and nutrients it needs to rapidly grow. So try and stay away from the high nitrogen fertilizers. What you want to do is look for high calcium and high potassium and phosphorus as well. So what I like to do is chicken manure. Chicken manure pellets are easy to come by. You can also use your own chicken manure from your own chickens if you have. They are very high in calcium. And what calcium does is it facilitates plant growth in terms of the actual structure of the tree and the leaves, but it also helps the immunity of the plant. So if you are giving it a lot of calcium, it's helping the tree basically defend itself, which is the opposite to giving it lots of nitrogen, which makes it very vulnerable. So that would be my suggestion for your primary fertilizer, is use something like chicken manure, which is, I would say, average on the nitrogen. It's not high, but it's also not low. It's kind of average, but it's much higher on the calcium side. Then the next thing you want to look at is something like bone meal. What bone meal is going to do is give you a high phosphorus count. The phosphorus is going to help with healthy roots. It's going to further increase the overall health and structural integrity of all the plant cells. But it's a slow release, which means it's not going to put the tree into any immediate shock or growth stage. The other thing that I always add to all of my plants is kelp meal, also mulled seaweed, basically dried seaweed. What that has is seaweed is incredibly high in micronutrients. In fact, I've done some research and mulled seaweed has more than 60 different nutrients in it. So what that is doing is it's feeding your tree everything that it needs. Usually what happens is people go out and they buy whatever fertilizer and they're looking at the NPK value, which is nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. Those are your macronutrients, and it's all good and well. The plants need that, but they also need micronutrients. Much like humans, we need carbs, proteins and fibers, but we also need minerals and vitamins. So we can't just keep eating bread and steak. That's not going to give us a balanced diet. As long as we are balancing our diet with other plants and food sources that can give us micronutrients and vitamins, that's exactly what we need to be doing for our trees. And that's why I always add in kelp meal or mulled seaweed, which is going to give us that balanced, healthy macro and micronutrient feed that your tree ultimately needs. So now that you can see we've got a nice layer of fertilizer here, chicken manure, mulled seaweed and the bone meal, we can now start looking at doing the most important next step. So in part one, it was all about rehydrating this tree. Now we need to maintain the moisture, but we don't want to be overwatering or drowning this tree. So this next phase is really, really important, especially in the hotter months. We need to start mulching this. And we don't need to do mulch, we need to do mulch. We need to add a huge amount of mulch onto this. Why I say that is we want this mulch to ultimately become a slow release compost and food for the tree. So what I'm talking about here is don't go buy anything. Go around the garden, go around your neighborhood, collect as many leaves as you possibly can. Water those leaves in really well, and with time, those leaves are going to get filled with little earthworms and all different kinds of living organisms. They're going to start breaking it down. That is going to be the best food for your tree over time. It's also going to insulate the soil so that you don't have any evaporation and you can keep this tree hydrated and ultimately feeding it slowly in a controlled manner over time. So I'm going to apply a healthy dose of leaves from around the garden so you can see what it looks like and the importance of it. I did not expect it to be this dusty. But anyway, let's make it work. So from the sandy situation it was before, I'm sure you can appreciate that this is a much better position for the tree to be in. Lots of organic, healthy, natural mulch that's going to break down, create a beautiful layer of insulation, and ultimately feed the tree long term. We need to give this a good soak. So there'll be some sprinklers overnight. Give this a good soak. Make sure that all the fertilizers that we just applied have an opportunity to get nice and wet and break down underneath this. And then we're going to leave it to do its thing and come back, I would say, in a couple of months' time so we can see what the next stage is. Okay, so now this tree has done its second phase in its recovery. We have now, in summary, given it a really good dose of balanced fertilizer that gives it what it ultimately needs to support the new growth and the flowering that it's going through. We're not going to go through and pick off all the flowers because the tree is flowering with its own ability. We are just going to support it with some fertilizer. Then we are keeping the soil moist and we are keeping the nutrients that we've just put down wet and moist so that it doesn't dehydrate in the sun, dry out, and ultimately become kind of useless. So mulch the tree up, give it a good feed, and then what we're going to do is we are just going to let this tree do what it needs to do. We are not going to prune it. Don't be tempted by all of these long legs that are coming out of the tree or strange growth that you see. We are not yet ready to prune this tree. It will weaken it and set it back. We need as much growth on this tree, let it do what it needs to do. We will come back in a couple of months. Once all of this has started breaking down, we can see a significant amount of new growth. Then we will come back and then I'll do a beautiful and comprehensive mature pruning video so that you know how to handle these from a pruning point of view. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. As with my other videos, please subscribe to the journey so that you can see where this beautiful lemon tree is ultimately going to go. And if you've got any questions about part 2 in this series of restoring a mature lemon back to its former glory, drop them down in the comments. I will get back to you. And until next time, happy growing.